I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
And welcome to the briefing with me, Isabel Oakeshott. We've got a packed show today. We're going to be kicking off with that seismic by-election win by the Liberal Democrats in North Shropshire. We're going to speak to a Tory commentator and a senior Lib Dem. And will schools reopen in January, or will COVID scaremongering win again? I'll ask the Conservative chairman of the Education Committee. And China's dirty tricks. Will Sunday's dodgy election in Hong Kong be the death knell for democracy there? All that's coming up, but first, it's the news. I'm Rhiannon Jones. This is your news at 12 o'clock. The Conservatives have lost one of their safest seats, with the Lib Dems taking a shock victory in the North Shropshire by-election. Helen Morgan won by almost 6,000 votes to take the seat the Tories have held for almost 200 years. The by-election was sparked by the resignation of Owen Paterson over breaching lobbying rules. He had a 2019 majority of almost 23,000. The result applies more pressure on Prime Minister Boris Johnson, with the Lib Dems describing the win as a watershed moment in politics.
Tonight, the people of North Shropshire have spoken on behalf of the British people. They've said loudly and clearly, Boris Johnson, the party is over. Your government, run on lies and bluster, will be held accountable. It will be scrutinised, it will be challenged, and it can and will be defeated.
A woman has been arrested after 4 young boys died in a house fire in South London. Our reporter Alice Porter is at the scene in Sutton. Alice, another horrific and tragic case involving children. What more can you tell us on this case?
Well, people in Sutton have been coming here to the scene on Collingwood Road and laying floral tributes to the 4 boys who died in last night's blaze. They were 2 3-year-olds and 2 4-year-olds, 2 sets of twins, all believed to be related, and they died last night in the blaze that took 60 firefighters to bring it under control. It's understood that the boys had been left on their own, and a 27-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of child neglect. The boys have not been named publicly by the police, but it's understood that they attended Westbourne Primary School. I've been in touch with them, and they say their school and its entire community are devastated at the news of the tragic loss of the 4 children. Our hearts, thoughts and prayers are with the family and anyone else affected by this heartbreaking event. And we'll be bringing you updates on this story as it develops throughout the day.
Alice, thank you. Migrants continue to take on the perilous journey across the Channel to reach the coast of Britain. For a 3rd consecutive day, hundreds more have been intercepted. GB News have captured some dramatic footage of one particular rescue. Our Home and Security Editor Mark White is in Dover with the details.
Well, for a 3rd calm day in the English Channel, hundreds more migrants have been intercepted in small boats as they crossed into UK waters, and as you can see, brought here to Dover. Other boats have actually made it to the beaches of Kent. Our local producer caught some dramatic images of 22 migrants who landed at the foot of steep cliffs near St Margaret's Bay. Most scrambled ashore, but an elderly man and a woman and her child had to be rescued by authorities.
Nightclubs in Wales will close from December the 27th as part of new restrictions. That's after a surge in cases of the Omicron COVID variant. There'll be a return to mandatory 2-metre social distancing in offices. Measures including one-way systems and barriers will also be introduced. The Welsh Government has announced a £60 million fund to help businesses affected by the new measures. It's also urging people to have a smaller, safer Christmas as the UK deals with a surge in COVID cases. Meanwhile, Scotland's also introducing new COVID guidance to tackle increasing cases of the virus. Businesses are now legally required to take reasonable measures to minimise transmission of the new variant. Similar to Wales, the guidance includes a return to one-way systems, app-based ordering and the use of screens at service points. The Chancellor is to hold crisis talks with businesses in the hospitality sector over COVID concerns. Rishi Sunak's under pressure to provide support to pubs and restaurants hit by mass cancellations in the build-up to Christmas. The Chief Medical Officer has advised people to prioritise the events that matter to them. Industry experts estimate over £2 billion of trade have already been lost in the sector's busiest time of year. The UK and Australia have signed a landmark trade deal. The agreement, first announced in June, has now been finalised at a virtual signing. Officials estimate it could eventually generate more than £10 billion of additional trade each year. The deal will cut tariffs on imports and make it easier for young Brits to work down under. It's the first deal the UK has negotiated from scratch since leaving the European Union. Rail passengers will be hit by the largest fare rise in nearly a decade next year. The Department of Transport has announced an increase of 3.8% from March the 1st. Rail Minister Chris Heaton-Harris says fees are being capped in line with inflation and that it would allow further investment in the railways. I'll have the latest headlines for you in half an hour. That's it for now. Back to briefing and Isabel Oakeshott.
Well, the Conservative Party is reeling from its worst by-election defeat this century after losing one of its safest seats in the country. North Shropshire, the constituency that was held by Tory MP Owen Paterson until he resigned in a sleaze scandal, has been true blue for almost 200 years. Now it's gone to the Lib Dems, and they overturned a Tory majority of almost 23,000, and they had a couple of thousand votes to spare. Here's how the leading candidates did. No small win for the Lib Dems with almost 18,000 votes. That's nearly 6,000 ahead of the Conservatives, and there's Labour in at a distant third. Whatever spin they put on it this morning, it is an appalling result for the Tories. And up and down the country, millions of people will be feeling that Boris Johnson and his party, frankly, deserved it. I'm one of those people. Not so long ago, I felt the Conservative Party represented my views, standing up for liberty, low tax, free enterprise and opportunities for all. These days, honestly, I no longer recognise it as Conservative. High tax, high spend and astonishingly authoritarian, it is the most high-handed, out-of-touch, arrogant administration I have ever reported on, and that's in 20 years. That's how I personally felt before the catalogue of revelations about partying in Downing Street and partying in Tory headquarters while the rest of the country was in lockdown this time last year. It seemed that these people were sticking two fingers up at everybody else who was suffering under the rules they created. So what does last night's result mean? Well, doubtless Tory High Command will try to brush it off as midterm blues. They're going to stress that Labour also crashed and burned. They'll talk about learning lessons and hearing the message from voters and being determined to get on with the job and all that other blah. The question is whether Boris Johnson, a man who can't even be bothered to comb his hair or tuck in his shirt, is going to change. And will he start showing the people who put him in his job, that's you, a modicum of respect? Well, with me to discuss last night's earthquake is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Hi, Darren. What do you make of the result? An absolute earthquake. The Tories are reeling, aren't they? Really struggling to put a positive gloss on this one.
Yeah, indeed, extraordinary, Isabel, in many regards. And we have just heard from the Prime Minister talking to reporters in the last couple of minutes, very much conveying the words that you suggested he may well do, saying that he is very disappointed by the result, that he totally understands people's frustrations. I hear what voters are saying. In all humility, I've got to accept the verdict, but says that he has to get his job better over to the public, the messaging, more effectively, but that ultimately, in the end, he does take responsibility for that defeat. And what an incredible defeat it was. This part of the country's been strong Tory blue for 200 years. Owen Paterson, 23,000 vote majority, one of the safest Conservative seats in the country. And yet here we are talking about a Lib Dem victory, quite a significant one for them. Lots of things came into play here. There was clearly some tactical voting, wasn't there, from Labour voters who switched to the Lib Dems. A lot of Conservatives didn't bother to turn out to vote, turned out only 45%, which is not bad for a by-election in December, but still way below what you'd expect in a general election. But you're right in touching on the different issues at play here. The biggest one that seems to have turned the tide, though, in recent weeks are those allegations about Christmas parties in Downing Street. Those attacks from the opposition about how it's one rule for the Prime Minister and his colleagues and another rule for the rest of us. That does seem to have resonated here with voters. My colleague Balvinda Sidhu has been in this constituency for the last couple of weeks, and she said that was what cropped up time and time again. In the immediate term, I think this has got two consequences, Isabel. First of all, when it comes to potential further restrictions in England, it is clear the Prime Minister was boxed in by that vote on Tuesday night, that big rebellion we saw within the Conservative Party. I would suggest this vote, given the reaction of some Conservative MPs this morning, make that even more difficult if the Prime Minister wanted to go down that route. We know, of course, in Scotland and Wales, they're talking about new restrictions. And secondly, it is that damage to the Prime Minister's authority. Now, we can always over-egg these things. It is mid-term. It is one by-election. Governments have suffered these before in the past. But this is really damaging for the Prime Minister's credibility, for his authority. It is raising questions on the backbenches about a possible leadership challenge next year. And all this at the middle of a torrid time for the government over the last couple of months. And it is far from over with that inquiry into those parties expected to report back any day now from the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you so much, Darren McCaffrey, our political reporter there. So now let's speak to Lib Dem peer Baroness Sal Brinton, a former president of the party, after a fantastic night for you. What do you think, Sal, made the difference here? Obviously, this was a true blue seat. To turn over a majority like that is phenomenal. What are you putting it down to?
I think there are a number of things. By-elections always have special rules, and one of the key ones was that our candidate was local. She lives and works in the constituency, was well known, and that was important in such a short campaigning time. But it was also clear when I was talking to voters right at the very start of the campaign, particularly Conservative ones, that whilst they were angry with Owen Paterson, they were particularly angry with Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg about trying to pull the wool over the eyes of Parliament to get Owen Paterson to stay on. And as time went on, every day there seemed to be another story. You talked about them being arrogant. The one message that we've been getting clearly is that people think that they are being taken for granted. There is one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us. And honestly, Partygate over the last 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, has just compounded that. We were talking to people who had voted for other parties all their lives who said they will never vote Tory again. People from the Labour Party lent us their vote, ditto the Greens. It was just an absolute visceral fury from the electors of North Shropshire.
I think that's right. What's interesting is you don't once mention there any Lib Dem policies. Just very briefly, which Lib Dem policies do you think voters found so attractive, if any?
Well, one of the big problems in North Shropshire at the moment is the pressure on health services. And they do like the fact that we have been holding this government to account in both the Commons and the Lords and pushing for more emergency money for ambulance services, trying to make sure that Shrewsbury Hospital gets the extra beds that it needs. That's the sort of thing that really, really resonated. And I know that Helen Morgan will be campaigning for that the moment she gets into the Commons.
Realistically, what you characterised as the main reason for people voting Lib Dem was nothing to do with your policies. This was more of an anti-Tory vote, really, wasn't it, if we're honest?
There is always an element of that, but I do think the other big issue, which is fundamental to Lib Dem values, is that the voters in North Shropshire kept saying that they'd never seen politicians campaigning at election time. And we used our community grassroots knowledge and understanding and absolutely talked to them about what we were going to do, what we have done, and what we will do in the future if they elected Helen. And we know from Chesham and Amersham that people like their new MP there. Your colleague said, oh, this is once in a blue moon. This is the second massive by-election win that we've had over the Conservative in seats that people just wrote off beforehand. But there is something going on at the moment. And we feel that our policies, certainly, but also people need to be able to say, actually, we have had enough of this Tory government, corrupt, thinking only of itself, and it's time for a change.
Thank you very much, Baroness Salbrinton. So now let's speak to the Conservative commentator Ali Mirage. Ali, the top Tories this morning are barely even trying to put a sort of decent spin on this. You know, we've heard Boris Johnson taking full responsibility. It is all his fault, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Isabel, and I don't think it's in any way possible to disguise that fact. I know that the party chairman was on the airwaves this morning trying to put the best spin on this sort of sorry situation that he could. But look, if the North Shropshire by-election result was a turkey, then you could say that it was stuffed, basted, and roasted in Downing Street. This has all happened on the back of a series of self-inflicted mess-ups that really have to be laid at the Prime Minister's door. And it started with Owen Paterson, the former Conservative MP for North Shropshire, that was found to have broken the codes. He was subject to a discipline, which he didn't actually want to fess up to. And this all happened because the Conservative Party was trying to change the rules around this after the decision had already been made by the Standards Commissioner, which went down like a lead balloon, only to then reverse the position once there was a public outcry over this. So that's where this all started. Then you've had various other mishaps, including Christmas Partygate, multiple parties supposedly have happened, and ongoing issues about who did or did not pay for the Prime Minister's wallpaper for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat. So these are all tittle-tattle issues that divert from the main business of government, which is dealing with the pandemic, but also the levelling up agenda, etc. And the public has got no truck with it, and Conservative MPs are themselves getting increasingly frustrated.
Ali, thank you for that. A pretty damning assessment. I think the question that many people up and down the country will be asking this morning, if they're politically engaged, and I know you and I, people like us, tend to get a bit carried away with this stuff, is this Prime Minister going to be leading his party into the next election? And of course, a lot of Tory MPs are utterly obsessed by that question. What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think that certainly the atmosphere amongst all the Conservative MPs that I speak to a lot of them, is very febrile. You heard Sir Roger Gale, veteran Conservative MP, coming out this morning saying the Prime Minister's done 2 strikes. If there's a 3rd strike, he'll be out. But Charles Walker, prominent member of the Backbench 1922 committee, taking a slightly different view and saying the Prime Minister's got a year to sort it out. I think the truth lies somewhere in between. I think any more self-inflicted wounds like this next year, early next year, will just not be tolerated. I think people will wait for the May election results, and then they'll come to a conclusion probably in the middle of next year as to how things are looking, and certainly want to try and draw a line under this during the Christmas period. But it has been a torrid few months for the Prime Minister. And if you look back, Isabel, just only to the beginning of October in Manchester, when the Prime Minister gave a speech at the Conservative Party conference, he was master of all he surveyed. You know, still close to 80-seat majority, but he's been really wounded this week. You saw the almost 100 MP rebellion from his own backbenchers on Tuesday night in relation to vaccine passports. And I think that patience is wearing thin. So I think he's got 6 months to try and turn it round. And we know that he's the Teflon politician and he can bounce back, but it's in his hands.
Yeah, he's down, not totally out, but very, very interesting few months ahead. Thank you very much, Ali Mirage. And now let's turn away for a minute from the by-election, because First Minister Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland is giving an update on possible new COVID restrictions north of the border. Let's hear what she has to say.
Cases were likely to be the Omicron variant. Today it is 51.4%. So that does mean Omicron has now replaced Delta as the dominant COVID strain circulating in Scotland. And that presents a challenge because we know Omicron is significantly more transmissible than Delta. It has an R number that is possibly above 4, and therefore it is driving, and the bigger the proportion of cases that are on Omicron, the more it will drive, or the more it risks driving, a much steeper increase in cases overall. Indeed, cases have already increased in the past week by more than 40%, and we should expect to see that continue and indeed accelerate in the period ahead. The tsunami I warned about a week ago is now starting to hit us. However, and this is a key point, a really key point actually, we shouldn't be fatalistic about this. We are not powerless in the face of it, and I will return later to what we can all do now, individually and collectively, to slow down the spread of Omicron and try to avoid these worst fears that we have right now coming to pass. And slow it down we must, because there is no doubt that as of now, the scale and the immediacy of the challenge it presents is of profound concern. Even if it did turn out to be generally a little bit less severe for most people, and I want to stress again, we still don't know that to be true. For some people, even if that was true, it will still cause serious illness and hospitalisation, and tragically, more people will die. And even if the number of people falling seriously ill is a smaller percentage of cases than with Delta, the basic fact of arithmetic is inescapable. A smaller percentage of a much bigger number of infections will result in a massive number of cases needing hospital care. Indeed, total hospital admissions in Scotland in the week up to the 13th of December were slightly higher than in the week previous. So we're already starting to see an increase as a result of the relatively moderate rise in cases seen in previous weeks. Perhaps more significantly, in London right now, where the number of Omicron cases is currently the highest in the UK, hospital admissions are now rising quite sharply. If we don't act now, what we have feared all along since the very start of this pandemic, but so far managed to avoid, the overwhelming of the NHS, could happen. And that is one, not the only, but it is one very important reason why slowing this down matters so much. But it is also important to understand that this is not simply an issue for the health service. The numbers of people becoming infected, even mildly, and having to isolate is already putting a significant strain on the economy and on other critical services. As people become infected, we lose drivers for trains, we lose teachers for classrooms, we lose nurses for hospital wards, and workers for businesses, the length and breadth of the country. So there really isn't a choice to be made. There never has been, but right now there certainly is not a choice to be made between slowing the spread of Omicron and protecting the economy. We will actually only protect the economy if we slow the spread of the virus and reduce the number of people getting infected with it. That said, I realise, I am acutely aware that the steps we're asking people to take just now, particularly that advice to limit social contacts, is having a severe economic impact. This is particularly hard on sectors like hospitality and culture. These have been badly affected by previous waves of COVID and the restrictions we've all been living with. And of course, these sectors were hoping, until recently, with some justified optimism, for a much better Christmas period ahead. So what has happened in the past 3 weeks has been a cruel blow to everybody, but it has really hit these sectors very hard all over again. That's why we in the Scottish Government have found £100 million to help businesses in these sectors. I can confirm today that 66 million of this will go to the hospitality sector, 8 million will go to the food and drink supply chain affected by hospitality cancellations, and that includes wholesalers. 20 million will go to the culture sector, 3 million to the wedding sector, and 3 million to the worst affected parts of tourism, including international inbound operators. We're working with councils, enterprise agencies and others to ensure businesses get this money as soon as possible. Those who've received support previously will be contacted directly, and further details of the funding and how it will be paid are available on the Find Business Support website. The support we are providing is significant, but I know it won't fully compensate these sectors for the impact they're suffering right now. That's why I wrote to the Prime Minister yesterday asking the UK Government to provide the support that is needed. In my view, business now needs the type and scale of financial support available earlier in the pandemic. And the reality is, whether anybody likes it or not, that can only come from the UK Government because it has borrowing powers that the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments simply do not have. I'll press this point with the Prime Minister when I speak to him later today. I had hoped that I would already have spoken to him by now because we must all realise that with a virus doubling every couple of days, businesses already bleeding, every 24 hours counts. There is no time to waste. I hope the conversation later will be a positive one and that it will give businesses the assurance of support that they so badly need. However, to return to the point I was making earlier, the best way in the longer term to support businesses sustainably is to get the virus back under control. In that, our first and most important line of defence is vaccination. It seems very likely that Omicron is better than previous variants at evading, to a certain extent, the immunity conferred by 1 or 2 doses of vaccine. But more positively, it seems that boosters are still very effective in reducing the risk of falling seriously ill from Omicron. So getting a booster is an essential way of protecting yourself and others, and of course of helping relieve and reduce the burden on the NHS. The booster programme has picked up speed in the past week.
So that was Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister up in Scotland, talking about quite a significant package of help for businesses north of the border. Now, that is going to set the cat among the pigeons here in England because the Chancellor has been under significant pressure to offer some support for businesses here that are already feeling serious impact of that advice to people from the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris Whitty, to just scale back their pre-Christmas celebrations and socialising. I think that the Chancellor will not be particularly delighted to be bounced into anything in this way by Nicola Sturgeon, who was obviously very keen to get in there first. And you may have noticed as well a little dig at Boris Johnson, saying she was disappointed not to have spoken to him within the last 24 hours, saying that every moment counts. So I think there'll be a lot of frustration in number 10 at Nicola Sturgeon's, what they will see as her politicking, and more pressure on the Treasury to come up with a package of measures, and I would expect to see that sooner rather than later. Now, let's return to that big win for the Lib Dems in North Shropshire at the expense of a Conservative Party which has lost a seat it held for about 200 years. We can now speak to Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Political Science at the University of Kent. Matthew, I know we get very excited about by-elections even when they're not that exciting, but this one really was a corker, wasn't it? What do you make of it?
Well, it certainly was a political earthquake, Isabel. As you say, this was the first time for 200 years this area has gone to anybody other than the Conservatives. It was also a pro-Brexit seat. We tend to forget nearly 60% of people voted for Brexit. This was the second largest swing from the Conservatives to Lib Dems in British history. It was the 7th largest swing of all swings in British political history. So, yeah, this is pretty historic. Now, if you're an ally of Johnson, you might say, well, we've had bigger swings than this before, and the governing party have still gone on to win a majority. Think about David Cameron, for example, losing Rochester and Stroud to UKIP and Clacton to UKIP, and Cameron going on to win that surprise majority in 2015. But make no mistake, I think the walls are closing in around Johnson. He should take this very seriously.
Thank you for that, putting it in some context there. I was wondering, is this the worst by-election defeat for the Tories this century, or are those 2 other defeats that you just mentioned there to UKIP, were they as bad as this? I don't think they were they?
Clacton certainly had a much bigger swing. Of course, we might remember, some of the viewers I'm sure will remember, that Douglas Carswell defected to UKIP, and in effect UKIP had never really stood in Clacton, certainly didn't have a presence before running against the Conservatives. This time around, of course, the by-election is taking place amid turmoil in Number 10, growing disillusionment with Johnson's premiership. And I think for me, Isabel, what this by-election is really telling us more than anything is that the very people who put Johnson into Number 10, Leave voters, cultural Conservatives, patriotic, hard-working Brits, are increasingly losing faith with the Johnson premiership. They took a gamble on him, and I think many are concluding that gamble is not really paying off.
We haven't talked about, Matthew, is what happened to Labour in that constituency. They pretty much crashed and burned as well, though I don't think they put that many resources into trying to win that seat. What do you think the Labour result in North Shropshire means for how the party is doing across the country and their prospects of getting anywhere at the next general election?
I think it's a great question. I think the Labour Party obviously lost support in North Shropshire. Very unusual for the main opposition party to lose support at a by-election like this. In the national polls, we've seen Labour now lead in the last 12 polls. Now, I understand why people might be sceptical of the polls. And we've also seen a little bit of an uptick in Keir Starmer's leadership ratings. However, my view is actually that the Labour Party remains quite a weak political party. I don't think Keir Starmer is seen by the vast majority of people as prime ministerial. I don't think Labour are trusted on the key issues of the economy and increasingly immigration, which is coming back into British politics as a result of what people are witnessing on the South Coast. And I think Labour's vote, Isabel, to me, is really riddled with problems. It's way too concentrated in the big cities and the university towns, which again we can see in North Shropshire, where Labour really didn't do anywhere near as well as they should have done. And it's not really branching out into those areas of, Brexit country, which it's going to have to win back if it's ever going to win a majority and get back into power. But Johnson does need to listen to this by-election. He really does need to reconnect with those voters who put him into power in 2019. And that means reconnecting around COVID, reconnecting around Brexit, reconnecting around levelling up, reconnecting around migration, all those core issues that put him there.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that superb analysis from Professor Matthew Goodwin. Now, coming up, we'll ask the chairman of the Education Select Committee if schools really will reopen in January. But first, it's your news bulletin with Rhiannon.
I'm Rhiannon Jones. Here are the latest headlines. Boris Johnson has called the North Shropshire by-election vote very disappointing. The Prime Minister's comments come after the Conservatives lost one of their safest seats, with the Lib Dems taking a shock victory. Helen Morgan won by almost 6,000 votes to take the seat the Tories have held for almost 200 years. A 27-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of child neglect after 4 young boys died in a house fire in South London. The children were 2 sets of twins, aged 3 and 4. 60 firefighters were called to the blaze in Sutton yesterday evening. A man has been convicted of the murder of one of the UK's richest men, Sir Richard Sutton. Thomas Schreiber was also found guilty of attempted murder of his mother, Anne Schreiber, the hotelier's partner. The 35-year-old carried out the attack at a house the three shared in Dorset back in April. Schreiber's mother was left paralysed by the attack. He'll be sentenced on Monday. Nightclubs in Wales will close from December the 27th as part of new restrictions. That's after a surge in cases of the Omicron COVID variant. There'll be a return to mandatory 2-metre social distancing in offices. Measures including one-way systems and barriers will also be introduced. Britain's rail fares will rise by 3.8% in March next year. That's according to the Department for Transport. Rail Minister Chris Heaton-Harris says fees are being capped in line with inflation and that it would allow further investment in the railways. I'll be back with a full update at the top of the hour. See you then.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Well, today's the last day of term for most state schools, and the big question is, when will the children be back? Publicly, the government insists we're not heading for a full lockdown in January. It's very clear the Prime Minister wants to get through Christmas, quite rightly in my view, letting everybody have the special time with family and friends that they didn't get last year, before potentially taking any other further measures. Privately, what multiple well-placed political and health sources are telling me is that there is a very real prospect of a complete lockdown in January, and that means schools might not go back at the beginning of term. Now, this is a subject I really care about. I've got 3 young children, and I've seen the effect on them of being kept off school for months on end. And honestly, they're the lucky ones. We've got a nice house and all sorts of other privileges. What about children from less well-off families? The impact on them of being kept off school can be devastating. Well, joining me to talk about the importance of keeping schools open is a Tory MP and chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon. Robert, I'm really sorry that we've kept you waiting for so long. It's been an incredibly busy news day, and thanks for coming on. This is such an important cause and one that you have really been campaigning on, isn't it?
Well, sadly, I've been campaigning for the last 2 years to try and keep our schools open for all pupils. And what I worry about is that despite what the government has said, that in essence we have school closures by stealth or de facto school closures, as I've described it. 230,000 children were not in school over the past few weeks because of COVID-related issues. We've got another 100,000 children being completely lost to the school rolls. I've called them the ghost children because the local authorities do not know where these children are. And we've got to keep our schools open. You know, you weigh up the minimal risks of COVID to the bigger risks, in my view, of children's mental health, their educational attainment, their life chances. We are damaging these children's lives every day that they're not in school. Remote learning is no substitute, and we know that the disadvantaged students learn the least.
Robert, can I just pick up on something you said there? You talked about the ghost children. Can you just repeat the number of those children that you say have been sort of lost to the system and explain again what that means?
So there's 230,000 children, according to the Department for Education, that have been sent home in bubbles or years because of isolation reasons or other COVID-related reasons. But separately, as identified by the respected Centre for Social Justice think tank, there have been, since the schools reopened in earlier this year, over 100,000 children lost to the system. They just haven't returned to school, all ages. We don't know where these children are. The local authorities don't know where these children are or what they're doing. Of course, some may be at home, educated perfectly well by their parents, but probably many others are facing safeguarding hazard. They may be joining county line gangs. They may face domestic abuse at home. And that is a tragedy. And what I don't understand is that the government keeps going on rightly that we have to protect the NHS and has a plan for the NHS. But what if we can protect the NHS, why can't we protect our children's futures as well? Why doesn't the Prime Minister get up with vision and passion and say, this is what we're going to do to keep our schools open and stop damaging their life chances? And why don't we have adverts about protecting our children's futures as well as protecting the NHS?
I mean, what you say there is truly shocking. 100,000 children who are basically missing from the system. And I'm afraid I don't share much optimism that they're being perfectly adequately home educated while they're truant, because frankly, it's hard enough for most people to home educate their children. I can't think we can expect much of that. Robert, you mentioned the Prime Minister and asked why he isn't standing up and doing more on this. Let's very briefly talk about last night's by-election result. It's not why you're here, but I have to ask you, where do you think it leaves the position of the Prime Minister?
Well, I should say, I do support Boris. I think we should remember that he won an incredible election just 2 years ago and gave the Conservatives a very strong majority. We also did very well in the local elections earlier on in the year. But of course, this by-election is a big warning. It's a kick up the backside to all of us. The political class, by the way, Labour didn't do much better either. So it's a plague on both of the big parties' houses. But as a Conservative, I believe Boris could be a winner again. I want him to set out a real passion and narrative what levelling up means, because my constituents often think it's about potholes. It should set out a vision for conservatism and show that we do have a destination to transform people's lives. I want us to be the social justice party and address the fact that so many people are struggling with the cost of living. I want to make sure that the COVID response is proportionate, that we balance the needs of our economy and job with the obvious need to protect the public from illness, and of course reset relations with the parliamentary party. And I think if the Prime Minister does those things, I think he can get back on track.
How long's he got, Robert?
Well, I think that I'm a supporter of Boris. I like him. I think he does have a Heineken quality. And I just want him to get back to that Heineken quality, to continue to reach people that other politicians don't always reach. And I think if he does some of the things that I've suggested, I think that he can get back on track. But I very much hope that we will.
And just finally, Mr. Halfon, how optimistic are you about schools going back next term? I'm very worried about it. I think a lot of parents are. What are you picking up?
Well, I'm gloomy. I don't want to be gloomy because I think pessimism isn't a luxury that we should allow ourselves. But given that we have 230,000 children out of school, I want just a definitive statement from the government that there isn't a plan B or a plan C, but there's a plan KSO, a plan to keep the schools open and protect our children's futures. I want, just like the Prime Minister gets up on the telly and goes on about a volunteer army for the NHS, I want a real volunteer army of retired teachers, Ofsted inspectors, educationalists, university lecturers, going into schools and colleges where they have problems with teacher absences because of COVID, and making sure that children are learning again. I just want some imagination, passion and vision for our education service, as happened in terms of the NHS and the policies towards the economy.
Thank you, Robert Halfon, and thank you as a parent for championing this incredibly important cause. Now, for the actual segment called The Cause on my show, this week I'm looking at democracy in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was, of course, a formerly British overseas territory until it was handed back to the Chinese in 1997. And it was agreed that Hong Kong would maintain some form of autonomy from China under a structure known as One State, Two Systems. This Sunday, Hong Kong's going to be holding its first election since a repressive national security law was passed by the Chinese regime in 2020. It's something of a defining moment in Hong Kong's history. Over the past year, Hong Kong has seen a crackdown on pro-democracy activists with the arrests of high-profile figures, including Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong. Others have fled the city and taken up opportunities abroad, including coming to the UK. So now we are very lucky to be joined by the activist Nathan Law. Nathan fled Hong Kong after leading several pro-democracy movements. Nathan, thank you very much for coming on GB News.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. When did you first decide to put your head above the parapet in Hong Kong politics? What drove you to do that? It's a pretty high-risk thing to do these days.
Yeah, in 2014, when there was a round of discussion of political reform, Beijing promised Hong Kong people that we would enjoy universal suffrage, we can elect our own leaders in the city. But eventually, they didn't keep their promises. So we had a massive civil disobedience action. It was called Umbrella Movement in 2014. And by then, I was a student leader that I participated in the only negotiation with the government. Afterwards, I continued my activism. I found a political party. I was elected as the youngest legislator in Hong Kong at the age of 23. I was unseated due to Beijing's suppression. I was jailed because of my participation in peaceful civil disobedience protest. And then for now, I am living a life of exile. These are vivid evidence of the erosion of Hong Kong's freedom. It basically rhythms to my encountering for the past few years.
I mean, you've paid an extraordinary personal price for your activism. When you first got involved, did you expect such rapid success in terms of the party that you were involved in? And did you anticipate it ever getting as rough as it did?
I had never thought to become a politician or an activist. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My father was a builder. My mother was a street cleaner. What they want for me was I grew up, have a good job, stable life, provide food on the table. But eventually, when you witness so much injustice in Hong Kong, Beijing doing so much suppression, when you witness your fellows being arrested on the street, being treated badly by the police violence under authoritarian state, you can never elect your government so that they don't hold any accountability. Then you realize that as a young person, as someone who are not in the stage that I have to bear a lot of responsibility later in my life, then I decided to step up. I think it is a natural action when you are a person with conscience that you want to contribute your society and you want to make your society to become better.
Now, you got out, you had to get out. Do you see yourself ever being able to go back again? Presumably, you've still got most of your family over there. What's next for you?
I was a legislator for the city. I was jailed for my participation in peaceful protest. I had to leave. I had to cut my ties with my families. I had lost connection with my friends who are in jail. This is my beloved city, but I had to sacrifice in order to speak up, because when you're in Hong Kong, either you're in jail or you're outside of the jail, but you are silenced by the national security law, which criminalizes free speech. So for me, I had to make a difficult choice. But I think for now, it's really important for a voice of Hong Kong to be heard on the international level. So I'll continue to my advocacy work, and I hope that this work could urge the world to take a more assertive stance towards the Chinese Communist Party and to hold them accountable on their human rights violation in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, in Tibet, and to curb the rise of authoritarianism.
You found asylum here in the UK. I wonder how you feel about the UK government's approach to relations with China broadly, and more specifically, what about our response to the Beijing Olympics? Should we be boycotting that on a rather more impressive level?
the UK government has offered safe passage for millions of Hong Kong people, which this is a good policy that a lot of Hong Kong people, they can have a place free from the political persecution. But we definitely want the government to step up to offer those passage to the young people who are majority of the protesters who are arrested and persecuted. So I really wish the biennial scheme, which it can offer safe exit to the people who were born after 1997, which Hong Kong was already handed back to the Chinese territory. But in general, I think there are a lot more that we can do, even though for now, I think Hong Kong people are really grateful for what the UK government has been doing. For example, stepping up on sanctioning on Hong Kong's official, sanctioning corporations that are assisting the human rights violation, genocide in Xinjiang and also in Hong Kong, and to really step up the knowledge towards the Chinese infiltration in our own territory and to safeguard our democratic values.
Thank you, Nathan Law. Thank you so much for that. And we will look forward, if that's the right word, to seeing what happens in Sunday's elections. Now, I'm joined in the studio by Benedict Rogers. You are CEO and co-founder of the campaign group Hong Kong Watch. Tell us about Hong Kong Watch, what it does and what you're expecting this weekend.
Well, I co-founded Hong Kong Watch 4 years ago. I had previously lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover. And when the umbrella movement happened in 2014, that Nathan played such a significant part in, I realized something was going badly wrong in Hong Kong. I started to speak out just at an individual level in my spare time, as it were.
Yeah.
And then by 2017, realized there was a need for an organization that one person on my own, it wasn't really sustainable. So Hong Kong Watch is an advocacy organisation. We research, we speak out, we brief parliamentarians here and in other parts of the world. In terms of what's going to happen on Sunday, I mean, as you've already heard, it's a complete sham. The pro-democracy movement is totally excluded from contesting the elections because of the requirement to take an oath of allegiance, not to the country as we would do here, but to the Communist Party. Exactly. And they've rigged the elections in various other ways, reducing the number of directly elected seats, increasing the number of effectively directly appointed seats by Beijing, and various other ways.
It's just a complete charade.
Totally.
Just going back to the umbrella movement that you reference, I mean, the troubles of Hong Kong and those who want it to remain a free democracy have slightly fallen off the news agenda here. But if we cast back to that umbrella movement, it was big in terms of the coverage it got here. Can you remind our viewers what was going on? This is very much a youth-led movement, wasn't it?
That's right. It was the biggest movement that Hong Kong had seen until, of course, the subsequent protests in 2019, which were, I think, even bigger. But the umbrella movement was a protest for universal suffrage, because under Hong Kong's basic law, its mini constitution, there is a provision, there is a promise of universal suffrage, and people were demanding that be implemented.
Right, and that certainly didn't happen.
Exactly.
Did it?
No.
And you know, the way that the Chinese regime deals with this sort of thing is that they essentially round up the ringleaders, as they see it, and they incarcerate them.
Right.
As of now, how many significant Hong Kong freedom and democracy activists are languishing behind bars?
Well, hundreds are behind bars, and if you think of all the major democracy leaders, they are either behind bars, on trial. Some are serving suspended sentences. People like Martin Lee, who's known as the father of the democracy movement, is serving a suspended sentence. And then a few like Nathan are in exile. So pretty much all the democracy leaders have been driven out in one way or another. And specifically, in January this year, 53 former legislators and candidates and activists were arrested, and 47 of them charged under the national security law. And their crime was simply for holding a primary election last summer to choose their candidates for what should have been the Legislative Council elections last autumn.
And what's happened with Jimmy? Is it Jimmy Lai or Jimmy Lai? I'm not quite...
Jimmy Lai.
Jimmy Lai, let me get the pronunciation right. And now he is a very interesting character, isn't he? A tremendously successful and wealthy businessman. He has been extraordinarily brave. He's quite old now, am I right?
That's right.
And is he behind bars at the moment?
He is. And
he's been in and out, hasn't he?
He's been in and out, but he's basically been in jail since the beginning of this year. And
he used to run a sort of pro-democracy newspaper.
That's right. I used to write for
it,
in
deal.
fact.
I mean, you know, this was a very important publication.
That's exactly right. The Apple Daily, and it was the most popular newspaper in Hong Kong, the only pro-democracy newspaper.
No longer shut down.
And no longer. It was shut down this summer.
Yeah.
And he faces multiple charges and cases. I've actually lost count of how many he's serving at the moment, but he's got his big trial under the draconian national security law coming up on the 28th of December.
And would you expect him to ever get out of prison, or will they just keep him there?
I fear that he will probably spend the rest of his years behind bars unless something very significant changes.
So, very briefly, because we're coming to the end of the programme now, could the UK government be doing more? Should it be doing more?
Yes, it could and it should. I welcome what it's done for the British National Overseas Scheme, but it should be imposing sanctions. It should be making China pay consequences for what it's done.
And the Beijing Olympics?
Yeah, I mean, we had to drag out of the Prime Minister a commitment to a boycott. It should have been much more forthcoming, and we should be encouraging allies to do the same.
Thank you so much for coming on GB News to talk about the cause. Well, you've been watching The Briefing with me, Isabel Oakeshott. The show is back every weekday from 12 noon. Up next, it's On the Money with Liam Halligan. But for now, I'll leave you with your weather forecast.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello, we've got some stubborn fog out there through the day on Friday, often quite grey and cloudy skies as well. A little bit of brightness here and there, but those winds remaining light. That's because we've got high pressure across the UK anchored to the map here. You can see it will give us a fairly grey and cloudy picture with a lot of cloud trapped underneath this